Ecclesiastes Part 5. I asked this question last week. Could we handle heaven without something to do and an absence of time? And in order to ask that, I got some qualifiers. What is your definition of eternity? How do you measure time? What's a circadian rhythm? And next one, by the way, I'm going to show you what a circadian rhythm is. But when we ask what is eternity, but then how do we measure time? And everybody says, oh, come on. Everybody measures it by minutes, hours. Not necessarily. We measure time differently depending on where we are in our life cycle. When we are children, when we're working, when we have a family, when we're retired. Everybody measures time differently. It's still measured in seconds and minutes and hours and days and years, but we measure it, or at least we consider the measurement differently. When we talk about our circadian rhythm, it's a little small to see, but this simply says, at 2 o'clock, deep asleep, at 4:30 is your lowest body temperature, 6:45, sharpest blood pressure rise. Melatonin secretion stops at 7:30 a.m. 10 o'clock, highest alertness. 2:30 is your best coordination. 15:30 is your fastest reaction time. 5 o'clock, best muscle strength and cardiovascular efficiency. Then, this is interesting, 6 o'clock, highest blood pressure. Then, at 7 o'clock, highest body temperature. And then at around 9 o'clock p.m., melatonin secretion starts. Now, all of this is based not on you, but on the average and what they see. My sister was with the sheriff's department. She always worked the swing shift because she wanted to be able to sleep at night, but also have daytime to go skiing and mountaining. However, it was required for her, in order to maintain all of her certifications, on a regular basis, she had to work a period of graveyard shifts, 11 p.m. intel, and she had to work a daytime shift. What happens when you adjust your sleeping schedule radically for a period of time? What happens? It messes with things. And there are people, by the way, who are far better at adjusting their circadian rhythm, which is why, by the way, when you're on a submarine, their whole schedule is on and off. And why? Because they can't just tell everybody, well, we're all going to sleep during the night, and because you never know. When people are deployed worldwide, when Micah was living in Germany and Scotland, they were 12 hours different, which meant Nancy and I, if we wanted to talk to him, we had to think about it. All of this is about, once upon a time, you couldn't really call another country. You telegraphed, and it arrived when it arrived, and you got your telegraph back. When you left on a ship, you had no communication until you arrived where you were going. We lived within a bubble. And when they came up with the whole daylight savings time, it meant when you were traveling, it was a big deal for you to shift. Nancy and I arrived, I forget, there's a place up in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, where it's a half-hour different time. One of those weird things. And so when we got off the ship, they said, okay, it is 12:30. And we're like, and we had to adjust to that. When you are places that change time, when you adopt a new schedule, when you have children, when you have a baby, all of these things change your perception of time. Verse 11, God has made everything appropriate in its time. Key words, in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, but man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. When we view everything, not by a clock, either biological or sun measurement, we are subjecting ourselves to an arbitrary measurement, just as a foot or a meter are arbitrary. We may measure ourselves by seconds, minutes, etc., just as we say things are either a meter long or a foot long or a yard long or whatever. But all of that is arbitrary, decided a long time ago. When someone said, well, this is, how long it takes for the earth to go around the sun. And of course, we were off by a little bit, which is why we have leap day. But not only that, when they started dividing things down, they simply chose how they were going to measure it. You and I've got friends, by the way, who are up at 4 a.m. every day. They can't sleep past 4 o'clock, but they're in bed by 8 p.m. When Nancy and I moved to California, the news did not come on until 11 o'clock. Not 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Which meant we had to make sure that if we wanted to watch the news, but it also meant when I got up the next morning, it was amazing because nobody was up at 6 o'clock. Because they all slept in, because they wanted to watch the news, and then they wanted to watch the late shows. Depending on where you live, I've used this many times. When Nancy and I got to California, and somebody said, come over at 7 o'clock for dinner. If we showed up at 7 o'clock, what did they say? You're early. We go, what do you mean? Well, when we say 7, we really mean 7:30. But when we were living in Preble, Indiana, if somebody said, come over at 7 o'clock for dinner, if we showed up at 7:02, they would say, we didn't think you were coming. It's all perceptions. So when God says everything is perfect in its time, time is something that we can play with by observing a different form of measurement. This allows us to view things differently. When is the right time for something? And how do we determine when something happened at the wrong time? Can two people standing next to each other, experiencing the same thing, view time differently? I'll often have people say, my car broke down, and it could not have been what? A worse time. I had a flat tire. It couldn't have been at a worse moment. Other people say, this was absolutely amazing. We didn't plan it that way, but this was the best time ever. And all of this is subjective. God set eternity into our hearts. To understand this is to lead to the peace that surpasses all human understanding. If we know we are eternal, if we know that we cannot possibly do everything that we want to during the measurement of time that we've been given, and if we know that God loves us, if we start to wrestle with those questions, this is why Solomon said, God made everything perfect in its time. We want to set the clock. We want to establish when things are going to happen. We want to decide what the best moment is, because we're working off a predetermined script that we either stole from someone else or decided for ourselves. People talk about having a bucket list. There are books out there, 1,001 things that you must do before you die. Now, the problem with this is they're subjective. What is a life that does not do the 1,001 things, or that doesn't get everything done on their bucket list? Is that life actually less than someone who does? And what about somebody who gets those 1,001 things done, by the way, which they decided on, and still have 20 years left? Does that mean that's wasted time? When we start looking at our view of time and what we do when we live, God measures our life differently. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. And when God says this in the scriptures, it's not that he is saying, you got these 29 things done. And, if you'd gotten 0 to 5, that's failure. 5 to 10 is okay. 10 to 15 is good. 15 to 25 is really good. But anything above 25 is excellent. You got 29 things done, so you win the prize. That's not what God is saying when he says, well done, thou good and faithful servant. First of all of us are judged independently. Secondly, what we have is based on our time, talent, and treasure. if you notice a lot of the parables that Jesus talks about, he says, you have been given much, therefore much is required of you. You have been given little. Little is required of you. It's not about how much we get done, as in how we use what we have and what we use it for. In Matthew 25, instead of gathering, it's about sowing, where he says, you know, those of you, when I came to you and I was naked or I was hungry or I was in prison and you just abandoned me. And people are saying, when did we see you naked or in prison or hungry or in need? And Jesus says, insomuch as you saw the least of these and didn't equate them with me. Then he says, but you took care of me. And they go, we didn't see you. And he says, exactly, but you saw those in need and I was in them. And this is where Jesus says how we view this. And so many of his farm stories about seeds. And he says, when you sow the seed, understand some of it is going to be wasted. Some of it is going to spring up and it's going to look good, but it's going to die quickly because there's no soil and no water. Some of it is going to grow to the point where it just multiplies well beyond itself. Everything is relational, Jesus says. And this is why when we start looking at how Jesus works time, we begin to understand that Jesus doesn't care about the clock. He says, while it is daytime, you must do the work God has given you, because at nighttime, nobody can see. And so he measures it very differently. The parable of the virgins and the ones who forgot the oil and the ones who remembered it. It's about seeing the opportunities and making sure that we are ready for them. Man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. Our problem is being unable to see things from God's eternal perspective. We see things and we look at it, and I'll be 64 at the end of October. And so I start saying, okay, how many more years do I have left? What do I want to get accomplished in those years? What type of energy and finances and other things will I have in order to accomplish those things? However, when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was play. And when somebody would say, hey, if you'll come over and mow my lawn, I will give you $2. My decision on whether I would mow the lawn or not was based on one of two things. Number one, my mom says, go help your neighbor or go help your friend or go help a family member. And so it was, I didn't do it for the money. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But other times, if I needed the $2, I would go and mow it. I didn't want to go and mow it, but when they offered me $2 and I wanted to buy a model kit to build a plane and I needed $2, it was like, fine, if I do this, then I get this. It was about a reward system. Then you get into your 20s and you're earning and you're simply trying to gather stuff and do things. Then in your 30s, it's about children and it's about taking care of them. And then in the 40s, it's about starting to level out and figure out what the next steps are. And then in the 50s, you're getting ready for retirement. And then in the 60s, it's retirement. And in the 70s and 80s, it's trying to find out. And all of this is, and he says, you can't discover the things that God has done. Because you're so worried about this, because God sees eternity. And he says, look, your whole purpose is this moment in time. You're going to do a bunch of other stuff, but I put you on this planet for this moment in time. And in this moment of time, you are going to impact generation after generation because of what you've done. You aren't going to see what you've done. But the life you impacted at that moment is going to impact this life, which will impact this life, which will impact this life. And so it is 4 generations later that your moment that you took is going to come to fruition. You'll long be in heaven by that time. And this is how God sees things. God doesn't see things as in, I have to get 15 things done on my to-do list today. God says, everything is perfect in its time. And a lot of the things on our to-do list, they're important to us, but they aren't important to the bigger picture of things. Verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. I want you to think about this. What is the purpose of enjoying the moment? When you go to dinner, do you want to go in, have a quick meal, and get out? Or do you go in to savor the moment? And a lot of it depends. If you go to McDonald's and it's noisy, by the way, how many of you have ever been to Jamba Juice? If you go inside Jamba Juice, what is the biggest problem and why do you not want to sit in Jamba Juice to enjoy your smoothie? It is too loud. And it's ingratiating. I mean, it's just grating on your nerves because as they make the smoothies. Why is it, on the other hand, that if you buy Starbucks, you may want to sit and enjoy the ambiance? What does Starbucks offer you? The aroma, quiet. They always have some jazz music playing in the background. And the colors are meant to calm you. And so it's all about the moment. McDonald's was not made as a place for you to go and spend 2 hours eating your food. They want high turnover. Then you go to some of the really fancy restaurants in Waikiki. If you go to Morton's or one of them, you're looking at a minimum of 2 hours for the meal. Minimum. And this is about, because when they come out, the whole thing is about creating an atmosphere of 2 hours. So when Mike and I were in Chuuk, we were the only white people staying at the hotel. It is primarily used during COVID and after COVID. It was primarily used by individuals coming from there's hundreds of islands in Micronesia, and Weno is where the airport is, and so they would come in there. And so Mike and I went, and it was an amazing restaurant, and it was a great place. But this is the difference. So we went there the first night. We sat down at the table, and after 5 minutes, they brought us menus. 5 minutes more, they brought us water. 5 minutes after that, they came and took our order. So we are now 15 minutes, and we just placed our order. If the place was packed, or if we were the only customers, we would still not see our food for 40 to 45 minutes. They would bring our food out. Then they would come out about 15 minutes later, see how we were doing, if we needed anything else. They would refill my iced tea and Micah's soda. Then they would not show up for another 15 minutes after that to bring us the bill. Because when you came to the restaurant, this was family time. You were to be there for an hour. The whole thing was set for you to spend time with whoever you were eating with. We were there on the third night, fourth night, whatever it was, and they brought us soup. And Mike and I didn't order soup, and we flagged our waitress down. And she said, "Oh no, we always give soup to family. We'd been adopted." And then, as it turns out, she finally got up enough nerve, and she turned and she said, "I was told you're from Hawaii." And I said, "Yes." She said, "I lived in Hawaii for 2 years." I said, "Really?" She says, "My grandmother was going through medical treatment. I lived in Kapolei." I said, "Well, we lived just up the road from Kapolei." Then we really were family. Their view of time, their view of life is very different. And to them, if you go to a restaurant, see, in the United States, we go to restaurants because we're lazy or because we're in a hurry. There, if you go to a restaurant, it's a big deal. And we could tell because oftentimes the tables around us were filled with large families. When I say large, I'm talking 15, 20 people, whether it was breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And they were it, and we would come in, and they were there. When we left, they were still there. And the laughter and the stories, and it was obvious that this was all about an experience. Life is hard. There is no way around it. Whether you are rich, poor, healthy, or not, life is hard. And so when we say there is nothing better than to enjoy this life, If your view of life is limited to the number of years you will live and the things you do, since you don't know how long you will live and how much money and power you will have, that's when it creates frustration. You start saying, no, you don't understand. I have all these things I must do. What God is saying through Solomon is to enjoy this life, hardness and all, is the best we can do. We need to begin to see our life from a very different perspective, rather than about lists and accomplishments and 1,001 things to do before we die. We begin to see it in a very different mode. Verse 14, I know that all God does will last forever. There is nothing adding to it or taking away from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Philippians 2:13. For it is God who is working in you, enabling you both to desire and to work out his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world. Hold firmly to the message of life. Then I can boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run or labor for nothing. Notice what Paul says our job is. Our job is to shine like stars. Our job is to be seen as living a life that is different than what the rest of the world is trying to get or take for themselves. And he says, when we are seen as those who understand that life is hard, that you don't always get everything you want, that life is not fair, when we accept that and begin to live out saying, I'm still going to enjoy life, I'm going to do all that I can. Yes, I cannot do this, but I can do this. Paul says that we will be seen as these lights in the darkness. Romans 9:14. What should we say then? Is there injustice with God? Absolutely not. For God tells Moses, I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it does not depend on human will or effort, but on God who shows mercy. For the scripture tells Pharaoh, I raised you up for this reason, so that I may display my power in you, and that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. This isn't about fate. God is not a God of fate. It's about understanding that God has a plan. And at the end, it is God's plan that is going to be perfected and accomplished. And so everything in between, no matter how hard people and the world try to frustrate God's plan, they're not going to be able to do it. See, verse 15, whatever is has already been, and whatever will be already is. God repeats what has passed. Okay, this goes back to my whole time travel thing. God has already been where we're going. He's already been past where we're going to go. And so in all of this, everything is because God knows what shall be. Not that he's waiting for it to take place, but it's already taken place because God lives outside of time. Here's what Luther said. He said, even when man wants and tries to hinder the work of God, God still defends his work. God established David as king. Absalom persecuted him, but God in turn restored what Absalom took. So in other words, God says, David, you're going to be king. Absalom says, I will frustrate God. And God says, no. No. And by the way, just because you're going to win a few battles doesn't mean that you've succeeded. The things that are done by God are not inconsistent as human work is. Nor does God become bored with his work, even when he's fixing what we broke over and over again. The will of God stands no matter what. And so when God says this is going to happen, it's going to happen. And we can do whatever we want. Oedipus Rex was a book about finding out what the future would be and then deciding that they would thwart the future by changing it. And then it happens exactly the way that the prophecy took place. God says, you can do everything you want to thwart my promises and my plans. But in the end, it's going to come out just the way that I said. And this is hard. It's like, but God, I want this to take place, or I don't want that to take place. And God says, I have brought about all things. All things work together for good to those who love me and are called according to my purpose. It may not be the way you want it. It may not be the way that the world views as good, but it will wind up as good because this is how I've planned it. Verse 16. I also observed under the sun, there is wickedness at the place of judgment, and there is wickedness at the place of righteousness. One must commit their life to God and seek the appropriate time for all that we do, asking for forgiveness for our past, wisdom and strength for the present, and a vision and spirit to prepare us for the future. If we understand that if we attempt to live in God's will, the world is not going to cooperate. The world is going to fight us. The world is going to challenge us. So we have two choices. We can give up, or we can carry on. And in this, we accept that ultimately and finally, what God promised will take place. Not necessarily the way we expected it, not the way we wanted it, but it will take place. And so we say, okay, God, there are times when I have failed you, when I did not even try to do what you asked me to do. There are also times, by the way, God, in the future that I've already planned things out, and to be bluntly honest, it's not the way that you would have me live. So now I have to ask for the wisdom and the skill to accept your will instead of mine. This is why Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, do I have to go to the cross? Yet not my will, but thine be done. And this is where we struggle, because it is in this that we are trying to determine who we are, why we're here, and what the end result is going to be. Luther again, a stone that can be lifted and carried should be lifted and carried, but one that cannot be lifted should be allowed to lie there. Too often we try to change things that we cannot. Who remembers, what's that old thing from the 60s and 70s? Pia desideria. Teach me to accept the things that I, can accept, and then, teach me to, work against the things that can be changed. And it's the wisdom of knowing the difference between the two. I have to laugh because when Nancy and I were with the grandchildren a few weeks ago, Nancy, did all of the grandkids have a meltdown at one time or another? Yeah, so there's 7 of them. And it was interesting because we had a couple of them that would just scream, I want this. And you would say, no. And they would scream louder, I want this. And you would say, no. And they would scream even louder, I want this. And you have two choices at that point. Give in and say, fine, just shut up and here it is. Which of course teaches them the next time they want something, they just yell louder. Or you just deal with it. So I had taken Eden, our littlest, or our middle child, and we went somewhere. She was tired, and she just plopped in the middle of the floor and started having a meltdown. And I simply went about my work. I simply went about the thing that I had come to this place for. And finally, she gets up and she comes over and she says, can I have? And I said, yes, you may. But she just was overwhelmed. And at that moment, she just had to just kick and scream and just melt down. And then it was interesting because I just made sure she was safe. I made sure that, everything was okay. And after she went through it, no more than 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, she gets up and comes over as though nothing has happened and says, Grandpa, can I have? And I said, yes, you may. And then she was fine. And that's what God says. God goes, I need you or want you to be able to take this moment. You can have your little pity parties. You can have your, just screaming moments like David did in all the Psalms. And then what I want you to do is get to the point where you say, okay, God, I'm done with that. Can I move on now? And that's what Luther is saying. If you can do something, do it. If you can't, stop beating your head against a wall when you know you're not going to win. Verse 17. I said to myself, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, since there is a time for every activity and every work. And in other words, everybody's going to get judged. It's not just some, it's everybody. When Jesus says, I have not come to judge, what did he mean? Because he has the ability and the right. So why didn't he judge us? And the answer is because there's a time for that. There's a time reserved. Jesus said, I have not come to condemn the world. God sent me to save the world. So right now, it's not time to condemn. Let's not, we're not here to start pointing fingers and saying, you're lost, you're lost, you're lost, you're saved, you're saved. He says, instead, right now, this is a much bigger thing. It is appointed once for a man to die, and then the judgment. That's Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed once for a man to die, and then the judgment. Our job is not to judge, but rather to do whatever we can to get people to turn around, because only God can judge. Judgment, by the way, infers a permanent condition. When somebody is sinning, and we say, please stop, repent, turn around. The moment that we say, you are condemned, we have misspoken. Because unless that person dies that second, there is always the possibility that they can turn around and repent. Maybe they're not responding to us, but maybe somebody will be able to get through, or a life experience or a moment in life will get them to turn from the way they were, where they needed to get back. If you want to read too, you can read Alice Cooper's biography on how God got him turned around. And it's one of those things, because when I grew up and Alice Cooper and his whole thing, and yet now he's a devout Christian. The drummer or the bass player for Megadeth is actually was a Lutheran pastor, and he turned around along with most of the band. And they get in trouble because when they go out, there's certain songs that they will not play anymore because they said that's no longer us. And of course, the crowd is like, no, but we want you to play those. No, we can no longer in good conscience play those songs. And so to judge is to place a permanent moment on this. Jesus says that's not this moment. It's appointed once for them. At the moment they die, they're judged. But until that moment, there is always the possibility. Now, God already knows who's going to be saved and who's not, but we don't know that. And so we can't give up on people even when we want to, or even when we think there's no hope. What we do is we look for somebody else. So again, going back to our grandkids, once in a while, if I am having absolutely no success, it's, you belong to Grammy now. And we'll see if Grammy can work through this. Because obviously I've tried everything I know and I failed. And Grammy usually does a lot better at success. If you've ever had a crying baby, sometimes when you get frustrated, even though you are doing everything you think is right, the baby senses your frustration. You hand the baby off to someone else, and they can get the baby quieted. James 4, verses 10 to 12. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. And there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and the one who is able to destroy. Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And this is all about when we want to judge people, when we want to speak in judgment, God says, not your job. I asked you to go out and forgive and love, but also speak warnings. The Bible says, by the way, if I know that somebody is sinning and I do not say anything to them, God says that I will be held accountable for them, because it was my job to just walk up and say, you need to turn around because this is not going well. In verse 18, I said to myself, this happens concerning people, so that God may test them and they may see for themselves that they are like animals. In confirmation, we teach the law is curb, mirror, and ruler. You know, and it's interesting. A mirror, you see yourself as you are. And this has to be a perfect mirror, one that shows you exactly the way that you really are, not one that, enhances you or takes away from you, but you see yourself as you are. The next is the curb. The curb does not stop you, but when you hit a curb, you know it. Mike and I were in Chicago, and we were headed to the airport, and we got to the rental car agency, and there was a line 15 miles long. Everything had melted down, and the lady says, you know what? I will take you to the airport. We said, great. She says, I'll turn your car on when I get back. Anyway, this lady was looking at her phone to get directions to get to the airport from where we were at, which I thought was funny, and she really was an employee. And next thing you know, she's driving on the sidewalk. And she goes, oops, that's not good. I'm like, I'm really glad we turned the car in before she decided, because I have no idea what the car's going to look like when she gets back. But the moment we hit the curb, she knew it because we jumped up 5 inches, and it was like, oh, that was a jar. Oops, I'm not supposed to be driving up here. And then the ruler. God has a straight line, and it's perfectly straight. And we may think we're walking a perfectly straight line, but it's interesting because when you draw a straight line, and then if you take a ruler and draw a line next to it, you will discover that our very nature, we can't draw perfect. We draw at an angle, there's all sorts of things we do. And God says, I want you to understand the purpose of the law is to lead you to Jesus. Jesus said God never tempts, but he does test so that the righteous may know that they are his. The purpose of temptation is to get you to fail. The purpose of testing is to prove what you know. I know that when you're a teacher, everybody says testing is about failing. No. If the student has done their work that the teacher asks them to do, the test is simply a confirmation that they have learned it. But everybody says, I don't want to study, but I still want to pass the test. It doesn't work that way. That's where temptation comes in. I can go and do anything I want, take the test, and I should still pass. That's not the way it works. Verse 19. For the fate of people and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. People have no advantage over animals since everything is futile. We think we're so smart. But are we really any different than the animals who do not worry about their life? In Matthew 6, he says, look, the birds just show up and eat. They don't worry about it. He says, you guys worry about what you're going to eat. You worry about what you're going to wear. The anxiety weighs heavy on you. He says, you are no different. All of us are going to die, whether we're an animal, a plant, or a person. All of us are going to die. The question is, what are we going to do with the life that we've been given? Increased mortality among people with anxiety disorders. That was a National Institute of Mental Health study, and I think they used either Harvard or Yale for this. And I had to laugh because does anybody see anything wrong with what it says? I was in the elevator over at Polymomi one day, and one of the doctors turned and said to the other doctor, if we don't do something, the patient's going to die. And so badly I wanted to say, the patient is going to die anyway someday. You cannot keep them alive forever. There is no such thing as an increased mortality rate. There is the increase, which is actually a decrease in life expectancy, or the person dying earlier than they should. But everybody's going to die. The study showed those who are very anxious live shorter lives than those who are able to deal with their stress. Everything else being equal, people with anxiety live shorter lives. It's a study that's proven over and over again, which is why Jesus says, stop worrying about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink and what you're going to wear. And why here Solomon says, the animals don't worry about it. Both of you are going to wind up buried. Notice the animals seem to be living a much better life than you. Have you ever seen a Labrador retriever that was sad? You offer a lab food and they're happy. Right, John? And, every morning, by the way, Grace waits until the alarm clock goes off. As soon as the alarm clock goes off, she jumps in bed. And if we do not pet her for a minimum of 5 minutes, she is sad. And then when Nancy gets up to take her outside, she plays this game where she runs to Nancy, and then she runs and jumps on the bed. And then she runs to Nancy, and she runs back and jumps on the bed. And she goes back and forth because this is her happy moment. She says, all night long, I had to sleep and wait for you humans to wake up so that you could pet me and feed me. And we just laugh. And then, by the way, we both go downstairs, and she goes to sleep. She says, okay, I'm done. Life is good. I'm happy now. Verse 20, all are going to the same place. All come from dust, and all return to dust. This is Solomon pushing our buttons. Because the first thing we're going to say is, I don't want to return to dust. I don't want to die. I don't want to be like an animal. If we're all going to the same place? Or is there a part of us that will not return to the dust? And this is where we're going to wait for Solomon to begin to draw out of us that which I think he is trying to, with all the words, all the challenges, all of his futility statements, I believe that he's waiting to draw out of us. Because if all of us are simply going to become dust, and that's the end of everything, then why read the book? Because what is the purpose of a long life versus a short life? Why do we say, oh, they lived a long life, versus when somebody dies early, we say, what a tragedy. What is it that we perceive is the difference between somebody who dies young and somebody who dies when they're 95? Does it or should it matter that there is something after this life? And I don't just mean for believers. I'm talking about anyone and everyone. Is there something that should matter if this is not the end? If after we die, something else is both possible or real? How should that, or does it change the way that we live? Because if there is something, then does it matter how we live? Or are the changes simply for the sake of this life? Chicken or the egg? Because there's, if you go and talk to some of these atheists who are very vocal and write books and go on lecture tours, they say that the only thing that the Christian church is good for is teaching people how to be good for this life. That's all that there is. Then does it matter? And should it matter? But what if there is something past this life? And how might we be pointing to it? Philippians 2, make your own attitude that of Christ Jesus, who existing in the form of God did not consider equality with God as something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a slave, taking on the likeness of men. Why would anybody do this? Especially God. This is it. If when he says everything is futile, why would God then come to save us? Which is what we are saying as a church. When he had come as a man in his eternal form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Okay, it's one thing to play dress up. It's one thing to come down to earth and say, all right, I'm going to hang out with people. I'm going to see what life is like. Once in a while, these famous people, they get all the makeup on and they try to come, Eli Manning went and tried out for a college football team, and he had a fake nose and his hair cut and all this stuff. People are always saying, I'm going to go find out what normal people live like. That's one thing. But why would God not only come and become one of us, but then actually die for us? Why would somebody do this? For this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and those on earth and under the earth. And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Is this the reason that you do this? Is this the reason you come down? Is this the reason you die? Is it so that you will be glorified? Is it so that everybody remembers you? Is it so your name is famous? Is that the only reason? And therefore, when Paul says we should be like that, the only reason that we are going to do what we are doing is so that we can be famous, so that people talk about us, so that people adore us, so that people put us up on a pedestal. Is that the reason? This is the difference between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. Is what we are doing bringing about glory and honor for us, or is it about bringing glory and honor to Jesus? And that's where we struggle. That's what Ecclesiastes is pushing us toward. We have to decide the purpose of this life. Verse 21, who knows if the spirit of people rises upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? In other words, when animals die and people die, do our souls go up and the souls of animals go down? I mean, who knows this? Isn't that the purpose of this book? If Solomon was simply waxing eloquently, blabbering on, why would anyone read the book? But if someone knows, how does that change our reasoning? And does it matter that if we know the difference, that we should, or how should we explain that? Verse 22, I've seen that there is nothing better than for a person to enjoy his activities, because that is his reward. For who can enable him to see what will happen after he dies? That's where we start talking about baptism. C.S. Lewis in this book, The Great Divorce, which is an amazing book. It is quite useless knocking at the door of heaven for earthly comfort. It's not the sort of comfort they supply there. What the soul cries out for is the resurrection of the senses. Instead of just smelling something, tasting something, feeling something, we began to experience what God intended for us to experience in the garden before sin messed us up. If we think what we can smell and taste and see and experience now is amazing, we don't even have a clue what heaven's going to be like, where it will be overwhelming, but it will also be very natural. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. Again, C.S. Lewis. That's where he's pushing us. Solomon wants us to see that whereas everything in this life is futile, it can lead us to that which isn't. All right, next, which isn't.